Killers is Iron Maiden's second album and would be their last to feature vocalist Paul Di'Anno because of his serious alcohol and drug abuse problems. Now, straight off the bat, there are many big differences between Killers and their debut album, Iron Maiden. The most notable being that there is no epic to be found. There are none of those classic Steve Harris epics that the fans just love so much. Another big thing is that the members of Iron Maiden inducted Martin Birch, and then after this they would develop a very long and good relationship with Martin Birch, who is an excellent producer. However, similar to Iron Maiden, a lot of the material on this album was written before their debut album was even released during 1975 to 1980 while the band was just doing gigs around England. The artwork is fabulous. It's one of my favorite pieces of Iron Maiden artwork. It's just Eddie standing there in the street holding an axe, and there's like a guy with his arm on his stomach. It just kind of makes you want to see the whole thing because you only get a small section of it. That's the kind of illusion that it portrays. And it's a great, great piece of artwork. I wish they had done more of these kind of artworks where it's just Eddie and there's no other stuff. It's just a clean picture of Eddie. You know, I miss those old pictures like Iron Maiden and Killers. And before we get into the track by track, it's just one thing I want to mention. Paul Di'Anno. Paul Di'Anno does a great performance on this album. This is probably the best performance of Paul Di'Anno ever. Not just in Iron Maiden, because I've heard some of the other stuff he's done. And the thing is with Paul Di'Anno is the way he sings, it's more based on the attitude, the punky and bluesy kind of attitude, where someone like Bruce Dickinson, he comes from a more sort of technical approach, whereas with Paul, it's more about the attitude. And it really shows, especially on this album. Steve Harris kind of adapts to his vocalist. He does this very well, whether it be Bruce, Blaze, or Paul. And it definitely shows because there are a lot of really bluesy, punky kind of songs that are more raw and not as kind of epic sounding as a lot of the albums they would do with Bruce. Besides that, Adrian Smith is in the band now, and this kind of starts, not really on this album, more sort of in the Bruce era, but it starts the Dave Murray and Adrian Smith classic Iron Maiden dual guitars. And everyone else turns in a good performance. Steve is great. Clive Burr is basically the same he was on the last album. And so without further ado, let's go into the track by track. Now the album opens with an instrumental called the Ides of March, and I'll just get this straight out of the way. It's not as good as Transylvania, but it's a good instrumental. I see it as more of an intro into the next song, Wrathchild, but it definitely stands out. Now, going into Wrathchild, this is probably the only song off this album that Iron Maiden's still playing in concert today. Even though I don't think it's the best, but it's a good song, really catchy. This shows off Paul's bluesy vocals very well. And similar to Wrathchild, Murders in the Rue Morgue also shows off the bluesy vocals of Paul Di'Anno. And it's also just really catchy, really great tracks. All these three tracks, Ides of March, Wrathchild, Murders in the Rue Morgue, kind of go together to make a great start to the album. And then the fourth track is Another Life. And this has a drum intro that I'm not a big fan of. I'm just gonna say, I'm not a big fan of the drum intro. Clive Burr is not as good of a drummer as Nico McBrain, and it just kind of feels out of place. Kind of like the whole song, actually, which just doesn't really stand out. It's not bad, it's just a filler. And the next song is Genghis Khan, and this is another instrumental. And again, I'll say, not as good as Transylvania in my opinion, but it's very gallopy. And a common complaint I hear from people maybe criticizing Iron Maiden is that everything's just a gallop, especially in the earlier days where the drumming was a bit elementary and everything was just kind of a gallop. But this is actually, I feel, is very appropriate for this track to be a gallop on the drums, because it's called Genghis Khan, and it kind of gives the effect of like the horde of the cavalry of Genghis Khan coming towards you. It's a pretty cool effect, really. Now, good guitar line, good overall track. Not as good as Transylvania, as I've said, but it's not too long, and it's definitely not a skip. The next track is Innocent Exile, and this starts with a bass intro, a bass solo by Steve Harris, and I like it. I think it's a good bass line, to be honest. And this is honestly one of the stronger tracks on this album. And this song, what I've noticed, is it kind of shows off Paul's more of an emotional side of Paul a little bit. You really have to listen in, but you can hear the kind of emotional side of Paul in this song. And then we move on to the next track, Killers, which is the best track on the song, in my opinion, the title track. And one part that I love the most is the opening. Kind of, you have Paul's vocal screams, and it's just building and building, and what it's building to is building to the excellent guitar riff. The guitar riff is just up there with some of Iron Maiden's greatest, to be honest. And once it gets into it, it's just a great song, fast, catchy, upbeat, all that good Iron Maiden stuff. But before we move on, there's just one thing I want to mention, is that they played this song at Live at the Rainbow, the concert with Paul Di'Anno, and they actually changed the lyrics for Killers, which I thought was very interesting. I haven't been able to find the lyrics for the performance, but if you listen to it carefully, you could definitely tell that they're different from the original. And then this goes into Prodigal Son, and it just doesn't work for me. It's a slower paced song, almost kind of ballady. It's not full on acoustic, but it has kind of an acoustic vibe going on. And instrumentally, it's good. I mean, it's Steve Harris, so of course it's going to be good. But the thing is that similar to something like Strange World off Iron Maiden, Paul's voice doesn't really sell this kind of style or tempo to me. It just doesn't work very well. And this goes into the second to last track, Purgatory, which is a great song. One of the standouts on this track, to be honest. And at the start, sort of the first minute, is very thrashy. And I can definitely hear the influence on bands like Metallica, Megadeth, Anthrax. All those thrash bands in America, I can definitely hear the influence, because this is really thrashy. Paul is singing sort of less rhythmically and more just kind of in-your-face, fast, kind of singing, thrashier, growlier kind of a voice. But then when it gets into it, it's just kind of a normal Iron Maiden song, and it's still good. Good Iron Maiden track. And this goes into the last track, Drifter. And this is, if there was an epic on this album, it would be the last song, Drifter. This is definitely the biggest epic-y sounding kind of track on this album. And Paul actually shows off his vocals a little bit on this song, you know, kind of going with some of the highs. Even though Paul's vocal range is nowhere near as big as Bruce Dickinson's, he still kind of shows off his vocals a bit, which I thought was quite good. And this song is just a great song, classic Maiden material. And then 40 minutes later, the album's over. It was really quick, really easy to listen to. Kind of a theme for the first 2 or 3 Iron Maiden albums. Just kind of put it on, listen to it. By the time it's over, it went by really quickly. And even though I don't think this is anywhere near as good as their debut album, it's still an absolutely great album. And it's not because there isn't an epic, it's just because I think the overall quality of the songs is not as good. And this is basically to be expected, because when it came to making their first album, they basically chose the best songs they had at the time. There were really only a couple left, like Killers and Wrathchild, some really good songs left. But the other tracks are just great. There are no bad tracks, maybe a couple fillers, but that's going to happen on any album. And that concludes the review. I will give Killers by Iron Maiden a 7.5 out of 10. Later.